The rain in Lake Forest, Illinois, has a particular kind of coldness to it in late October. It does not merely wet the skin. It seeps through wool and bone, through 40 years of memory, through every door that has ever closed, behind a woman who once believed she was loved. Margaret Holloway stood on the limestone porch of the house she had called home for 4 decades. She was 78 years old. Her white hair was plastered to her forehead, and her thin shoulders trembled beneath a charcoal cardigan that had once belonged to her husband. In her arms, she clutched a black heavy-duty trash bag. Inside were 3 folded dresses, a pair of worn leather slippers, a small photograph in a tarnished silver frame, and a green metal tackle box. The tackle box was the only thing that mattered. Behind the leaded glass of the double front doors stood Vivienne Ashcroft. 52 years old, draped in a cashmere shawl the color of bone, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Beside her stood her son Preston, 28, dressed in a navy cardigan, his arms folded, his mouth curled into the small private smile of a man who has finally won something he never deserved to play for. Vivienne's voice came through the narrow opening, smooth as polished glass. "You're 78, Margaret. Walter is gone. The free ride is over. This estate belongs to me now. If you set foot on this property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Then the deadbolt clicked. That sound, that small final mechanical sound. Margaret felt it travel through her like cold water down the spine. She stood there for a long moment in the rain, staring at her own reflection in the wet glass. A small old woman holding a trash bag, the wife of a billionaire, the woman who had raised the girl now standing on the other side of that door from the age of 11. She turned slowly, gripping the porch rail with one mottled hand, and made her way down the sweeping driveway. Her slippers were not made for the rain. Each step squelched. Each step was a small humiliation. She did not look back. Walter Holloway had built a logistics software empire from nothing. He was a man of broad shoulders and quiet rooms of long Sunday mornings, reading the paper of a laugh that came up slowly from somewhere deep and warm. He was 82 years old when his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 months before this rain. That was the official story. Margaret had been the one to find him. She had carried him a cup of coffee the way she had carried him a cup of coffee every morning of their 40 years together, and she had set it down on the cherrywood table beside his reading chair, and she had said his name twice before she understood that he was not going to answer her. The will was read in a paneled conference room downtown. Theodore Higgins, 70 years old, family lawyer for 35 years. Godfather to no one, friend to Walter, since before Margaret had ever met either of them. Theo would not meet her eyes. He looked instead at his legal pad, and his voice was flat and careful as he announced that Walter had revised his will 3 weeks before his death. Everything went to Vivienne. The company, the estate, the liquid assets, the offshore holdings. Margaret received a single clause, a one-time payment of $10,000, which Vivienne subsequently claimed was tied up in probate and refused to release. $10,000 for 40 years. Margaret had not screamed. She had not wept. She had walked out of that conference room with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her, the way her mother had taught her in 1955. And she had not allowed herself to cry until she was alone in the back of a taxicab, pulling away from the curb. For the first 2 weeks after Vivienne closed the door, Margaret slept on a sofa in the back office of the Methodist Church on Sheridan Road. The pastor, a kind round man named Joel Pemberton, asked no questions. He made her tea in a chipped white mug and told her she was welcome as long as she needed. But a church office is no place for a 78-year-old woman to spend her nights. The radiator clanked. The street lights pushed orange light through the Venetian blinds. Margaret would lie on the narrow sofa with her cardigan pulled up to her chin, and she would stare at the ceiling, and she would think about how a woman could live for nearly 8 decades and end up with everything she owned inside a single black trash bag. It was on the 15th day that Coraline Whitfield came for her. Cora was 68 years old. She had been Margaret's closest friend for 30 years. They had met at a charity luncheon in 1996, two women laughing at the same private joke about overcooked salmon, and they had been inseparable ever since. Cora had stood beside Margaret at Walter's funeral. Cora had brought casseroles to the house when Walter was sick. Cora had once said, holding Margaret's hand across a kitchen table, that she did not know what she would do in this world without Margaret in it. Cora arrived at the church in a forest green wool coat. Her silver hair swept back, her eyes wet with what Margaret took for tears. "Maggie, sweetheart, you can't stay here. Come home with me, please." Margaret did not have the strength to refuse. Cora lived in a tidy brick colonial 3 miles from the lake. There was a guest room with a quilted bedspread and a small window that looked out onto a garden gone brown with the season. Cora made tomato soup from scratch. She poured Chardonnay into crystal glasses and let Margaret talk for 2 hours straight. About Walter, about the funeral, about Vivienne's voice through the crack in the door. Margaret slept that night more deeply than she had slept in months. She kept the green tackle box on the floor beside the bed. It was Walter's. It had been Walter's for as long as Margaret had known him. He had carried it on their honeymoon to Lake Michigan in 1985, when they had rented a tiny cabin on the shore, and he had taught her how to bait a hook with hands that shook slightly, because he was already in love with her. The smell of that box was the smell of their early marriage. Stale lake water and old metal and a faint sweetness she could never quite identify. She had grabbed it from his study on her way out the door. She did not know why. She knew only that she could not leave it behind. On her third night at Cora's house, Margaret could not sleep. The wind was high. The maple branches scraped at the window like fingers. She sat up in bed at 1:30 in the morning, switched on the small lamp on the nightstand, and lifted the green tackle box onto her lap. The clasps were rusty. They resisted her thumbs. When the lid finally opened, the smell rose up to meet her like a ghost, and Margaret had to press one hand to her mouth to keep from making any sound at all. Inside were the things she expected: a spool of tangled fishing line, a handful of dried rubber worms, 3 rusted hooks in a small plastic compartment, a faded red bobber that Walter had used for 30 years and refused to replace. She ran her fingertips over the divider tray. She was not looking for anything. She was looking for him. The tray shifted. Margaret froze. She pressed down on the divider again. It gave way with a small, soft click that seemed enormously loud in the silence of the guest room. Her heart began to climb up into her throat. She wedged the edge of a hairpin from her own bun beneath the plastic and lifted. A false bottom. Beneath it, resting on the dark green plastic of the box itself, was a small velvet pouch and a folded sheet of yellow legal paper. Margaret's hands began to shake so badly she could barely unfold the paper. Walter's handwriting, slanted frantic, the letters jammed too close together as if he had been writing in a great hurry. "Maggie, if you are reading this, the worst has happened. Do not trust Vivienne. Do not trust Theo. They have been moving against me for months, and the medication makes my head too thick to fight them in the boardroom. They are doctoring the documents. I am running out of time. I left you nothing on paper because she would find a way to take it. Go to First National Bank downtown, box 402. Use this. Look up Maggie. I have loved you for 40 years. I love you still. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest and wept without sound. Her shoulders shook. Her white hair fell forward across her face. She wept for the man who had known he was going to die and had not been able to tell her. She emptied the velvet pouch into her palm, a small silver key. She slept very little after that. She held the key in her closed fist all the rest of the night, and she stared at the ceiling. And she thought about Walter writing those words alone in his study, with his hands shaking from medication he did not know was killing him. Morning came grey and slow. Margaret rose at 6 o'clock. She dressed quietly. She tucked the silver key and the folded letter into the inside pocket of her cardigan against her heart. She made her way down the carpeted stairs in her stockinged feet, intending to make a pot of coffee before Cora woke, intending to think. She heard Cora's voice before she reached the kitchen. She stopped on the bottom step. Cora was on the phone. Her voice was low and quick, the voice of a woman who does not want to be overheard. She has something, Vivienne. I'm certain of it. She came in with that green box of his and she has not let it out of her sight. No, I haven't looked yet. She sleeps with it next to the bed. I'll find a way. Yes, of course. I understand the arrangement. A pause. Vivienne, you promised me the lake house. I'm holding you to that. Margaret stood on the bottom step of Cora Whitfield's carpeted staircase for what felt like a very long time. She did not move. She did not breathe. She felt something very small and very quiet break inside her chest, and she understood in that moment that there is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to old women, and it is the grief of discovering very late in life that someone you have loved for 30 years has never loved you back. She did not confront Cora. She turned slowly, soundlessly, and climbed the stairs again. She packed her bag in 3 minutes. She wrote a short note on the back of a grocery receipt and left it on the pillow. Thank you for the soup. I have somewhere to go now. Maggie. She walked out the front door at 7:15, and she did not look back at the brick colonial. And she did not allow herself to think about Cora's face, because she could not afford the luxury of breaking. She walked to the Methodist church. She asked Pastor Pemberton for the loan of $40 and the use of his telephone. He gave her $60 and drove her himself to the bank. The lobby of First National was marble and brass and a hush that smelled faintly of polish. The manager who escorted Margaret to the safety deposit room eyed her wrinkled cardigan with thinly veiled suspicion. But the silver key turned in the lock, and the long metal box slid out smoothly onto the table in the private viewing room, and the manager left and Margaret was alone. She opened the lid. There was no money, no gold, no stack of cash she could have taken to a hotel and slept in clean sheets. There was a single manila folder. She opened it with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Inside was a property deed registered to a limited liability company called Blue Heron Holdings. Attached was a notarized document naming Margaret Holloway as the sole proprietor of the company. The property was a residential parcel of 42 acres in a place called Black River Falls in Jackson County, Wisconsin, a place Walter had never in 40 years of marriage mentioned to her once. Also in the folder was a heavy brass key with a strip of masking tape on it. In Walter's handwriting, the tape read, "Front door." Margaret sat in that small marble viewing room for a long time. She stared at the deed. She thought of the lake house Walter had bought her for their 25th anniversary, the one Vivienne had taken. She thought of the apartment in the city, the one Vivienne had taken. She thought of every safe and tangible piece of her life that had been folded into the empire and then folded out of her reach. And here was a thing Walter had hidden so well that even Vivienne had not known to look for it. Margaret put the deed and the brass key into her cardigan pocket. She walked back out through the marble lobby with her head high and her step steady, and she went to the Greyhound station on Harrison Street, and she bought a one-way ticket north for $38. The bus took 7 hours. Margaret sat by the window with the tackle box on her lap. The pine forests of Wisconsin slid past her in long gray waves, and she thought about 1985, about the cabin on Lake Michigan, about Walter's hands on hers as he showed her how to thread a worm. She thought about how a young woman could marry a man for love and live with him for 40 years and still discover in the wreckage at the end that she had not known the half of what he had been carrying for her. She arrived in Black River Falls at 4:30 in the afternoon. The sky was the color of slate. A cab driver, a soft-spoken man in his 60s named Owen, looked at the address she handed him and raised both eyebrows. "Ma'am, that's out past the old logging road. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He drove her for 40 minutes, the last 15, on an unpaved track so narrow the branches of the oak scraped along the side of the car like fingernails on a coffin. He let her out at the edge of a clearing. He looked at her standing there in her cardigan and her wet slippers with her trash bag at her feet, and Margaret saw in his face that he wanted to say something kind. "There's a diner in town," he said finally. "The Pinewood. They're open till 9, if you need to come back." "Thank you, Owen." She watched his taillights disappear down the logging road, and then she was alone with the silence of the deep woods. The house sat at the center of the clearing. 2 stories of weathered white clapboard, the paint curling off in long strips. An A-frame roof sagging in the middle. One of the front windows was boarded up with plywood gone soft from the rain. The porch listed slightly to the left. It looked like a house that had been waiting for someone for a very long time and had nearly given up. Margaret walked up the porch steps, half expecting them to give way beneath her, and they held. She pulled the brass key from her pocket. The deadbolt was stiff with rust, but it turned. The hinges shrieked. The smell hit her first. Stale air, old wood, the faint sweetness of mouse droppings somewhere in the walls. She fumbled in her cardigan for the small penlight Pastor Pemberton had pressed into her hand at the bus station, and she clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom of a living room frozen in time. Furniture draped in canvas sheets gone yellow with age. A stone fireplace cold and full of leaves blown in through some unseen gap. A coat rack by the door with a single green flannel jacket hanging on it, the cuffs worn soft. Walter's jacket. She knew it without having to step closer. She stood very still and let the tears come. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough that the light through the boarded window had gone from gray to a deeper gray. Long enough that the cold of the floor had begun to creep up through her thin slippers. She wiped her face on the cuff of her cardigan, and she lifted the penlight and she swept it slowly across the dust on the hardwood floor. And then she went absolutely still. The dust was thick, a gray carpet across the floorboards, undisturbed for what must have been years, except for a trail of footprints. They cut straight through the center of the living room and disappeared down the back hallway. Large prints, heavy treads, the deep aggressive pattern of tactical boots. The edges of the displaced dust were sharp, the indentations crisp. These prints were not old. They were days old at most. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Someone had been here. Recently. Her mind went immediately to Vivienne. To the cold, methodical way Vivienne had emptied the safes in the Lake Forest house in the weeks after Walter's death. If Vivienne had suspected, even in passing, that Walter had hidden something, she would have hired someone to find it. She would have spared no expense. Had they beaten her here, Margaret stood in the dusty silence and listened. The house creaked. The wind moved through the eaves. Somewhere in the kitchen, a single drop of water fell into a metal sink. She heard nothing else. No breathing, no floorboards shifting under someone else's weight. She was alone in the house. But someone had been here. Someone might come back. She did not have the strength to run. She did not have anywhere to run to. She was 78 years old and she had $36 in her pocket and a tackle box and a brass key and the memory of her husband's handwriting against her heart. So she did the only thing she could do. She followed the footprints. They led down the hallway to a small back study. The canvas sheet had been violently pulled off a heavy oak desk and thrown into the corner. The drawers were open, the contents scattered. Papers across the floor. A glass paperweight cracked clean down the middle. The intruder had been searching for something. The intruder had not found it. Margaret stood in the doorway of the study and read the disorder like a letter. If they had found what they came for, they would not have left such a mess behind. They were frustrated. They missed something. She thought of the letter against her chest. Look up Maggie. She raised the pen light to the ceiling of the study. Flat drywall. Nothing. She followed the footprints back out into the hallway. They went up the stairs. She climbed slowly, one hand on the banister, the boards complaining beneath her. The second floor was small. A bathroom, a master bedroom. The bootprints paced the bedroom in restless circles, ending at the open door of a walk-in closet. Margaret walked into the closet. A cold draft moved across the back of her neck. She lifted the penlight straight up. The closet ceiling was paneled in cheap acoustic tiles. Most sat flush against their metal frames. But one tile in the back corner, just above a built-in wooden shelf, sat slightly askew. A thin sliver of darkness showed at its edge. Margaret stared at the gap. The intruder had not looked up. She set the penlight on the wooden shelf pointed up, and she pulled the small step stool from the corner of the closet into position. Her knees protested. Her hands were not as strong as they had once been. She climbed 2 steps and pressed her palm flat against the tile and pushed. The tile lifted, sliding sideways, raining a fine cascade of dust and rot down into her hair and across her face. She coughed. She blinked the dust out of her eyes. She lifted the penlight and angled it up into the darkness above. A heavy aluminum drop-down ladder rested just inside the opening. Margaret reached up, caught the bottom rung, and pulled. The ladder unfolded with a series of metallic clanks that seemed to ring through the entire empty house. She froze, listening. Nothing answered her. The wind, the dripping faucet, the slow creak of an old house settling. She took a long breath. She set the penlight between her teeth. She put her hand on the first rung of the ladder, and at 78 years old, in wet slippers and a damp cardigan, Margaret Holloway began to climb up into her husband's last secret. The attic air was thick. It smelled of cedar and dry paper, and 40 years of held breath. She crested the opening and stood up slowly, her knees cracking, and she lifted the penlight and turned in a slow circle. The attic ran the full length of the house. It was mostly empty. A few cardboard boxes against one wall. A neat stack of old fishing magazines on a low table. And in the far corner, bolted directly into the load-bearing beams of the house, stood a vault. Not a hotel room lockbox, not a small home safe. A 6-foot brushed steel vault, the kind that belongs in a bank, the kind built to outlast wars. Margaret walked toward it slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath her, the penlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. The vault rose up before her like a monument, the steel handle, the thick wheel, the digital keypad mounted above the lock. She stepped closer, and then she saw what they had done to it. The keypad had been destroyed, smashed to pieces. Wires dangled from the shattered plastic housing. The steel face around the keypad was scarred with deep dark grooves where someone had tried to grind through it. The marks of an angle grinder. The marks of a sledgehammer. The intruder had found the vault. The intruder had been unable to open it, but the intruder had also made certain that no one else ever would. Margaret sank down onto her knees in front of the vault, very slowly, the way an old woman sinks when her body finally surrenders to a grief she has been carrying too long. The penlight slipped from her fingers and rolled away across the plywood floor, throwing a long yellow streak of light across the attic wall. She did not weep. She was past weeping. She knelt there in the silence with her hands pressed flat against the cold steel of her husband's vault, and she whispered into the dust, "Walter, I'm sorry I came as fast as I could." She knelt there for a long time. She did not know how long. When she finally reached for the penlight, her hand brushed against something taped to the side of the vault. A small square of yellow paper no larger than her thumb. She peeled it off. She held it up to the light. Walter's handwriting, 3 lines in that same frantic slant. "Maggie, if the keypad is broken, look behind the panel. I knew they would try. I'm sorry, my love. Look behind the panel." Margaret pressed the small yellow square against her lips, and somewhere in the cold of that Wisconsin attic, in the deepest hour of the longest October of her life, she began very quietly to smile. Her fingers hovered over the yellow square. "Look behind the panel." Margaret folded the small paper carefully and tucked it into her cardigan pocket alongside Walter's first letter. Then she reached down for the penlight and braced herself against the cold steel of the vault and pushed herself slowly back up to her feet. She did not have tools. She had a hairpin, a brass key, a tackle box downstairs full of fishing line. She thought for a long moment. Then she remembered the small folding pocket knife Walter had given her for her 60th birthday. A bone-handled thing 2 inches long, useless for anything but opening letters. She had carried it in the inner pocket of her cardigan for 18 years out of habit and affection. She had not used it in months. Her arthritic fingers struggled with the small blade. It opened with a soft, reluctant snap. Margaret wedged the thin blade behind the shattered plastic housing of the keypad. She pulled. The plastic resisted, then gave the broken edge popping free in her hand. She set it aside on the floor. She angled the penlight into the dark cavity behind. There, flush against the cold steel of the vault, where no thief would ever think to look once the digital keypad lay in pieces on the floor, was a small round mechanical keyhole. Margaret's breath caught. She fumbled in her cardigan for the silver key from the bank, the same key that had opened the long metal box at First National. Her hand was shaking so badly she had to brace it against her opposite wrist. She slid the silver key into the hidden lock. It slid in cleanly. She turned it. Deep inside the steel body of the vault, a heavy mechanical bolt drew back with a sound like a single satisfied breath. Margaret felt the vibration travel up her arm and into her chest. She gripped the cold steel wheel of the vault door with both hands, set her slippered feet against the plywood floor, and pulled. The hinges groaned. The thick door swung outward, heavy as a tombstone, and the light of a small penlight fell into the interior. And Margaret Holloway, 78 years old, widow mother by choice, betrayed by everyone she had trusted, leaned against the cold steel frame and looked at her husband's last gift. There was money. Bricks of shrink-wrapped $100 bills on the bottom shelf, neat as masonry stacked higher than her knee. Velvet pouches beside them, heavy with what she would later learn were gold Krugerrands, dull and old and worth a fortune. Enough to live on for the rest of her natural life and the rest of someone else's after her. But Walter had been a man of strategy. He had known that money alone would only make her a target. On the middle shelf in the place a man might put the things he cared about most sat three objects: a thick black leather-bound journal, two small encrypted external hard drives in a padded case, and a heavily sealed manila envelope written across the front in the same frantic slanted handwriting a single word: checkmate. Margaret stood in the doorway of the vault for a long moment. She did not reach for the money. She did not reach for the gold. She reached for the envelope. She carried it carefully back across the attic floor and sat down on one of the cardboard boxes by the wall. She set the penlight upright between her knees so the beam shone up against her chest. She slid one trembling finger beneath the wax seal. The envelope opened. The first document was a will, a new will, a real will. Notarized witness dated 5 days before Walter Holloway's death. Every line of it left everything to Margaret. The company, the estate, the accounts. Vivienne and Preston were explicitly disinherited, the language sharp and surgical, citing irreconcilable breaches of trust. Margaret's hand pressed against her own mouth. She read the document twice. She read it 3 times. She made herself look at her own name printed in cold black ink. Margaret Eileen Holloway, sole and exclusive beneficiary. Walter had not forgotten her. Walter had never forgotten her. She set the will aside. The second document was a private toxicology report. The letterhead read in clean small letters, a laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland. Margaret had never heard of it. She read slowly. Her English was perfect, her vocabulary educated, but the medical language was dense, and she had to read certain sentences 3 and 4 times before they would consent to mean what they meant. A synthetic amphetamine compound. Traces consistent with prolonged exposure over a period of approximately 8 months. Substituted in carefully measured doses for the patient's prescribed cardiac medication. The conclusion of the report was a single sentence. Cause of cardiac arrest is consistent with induced cardiomyopathy due to long-term covert pharmaceutical substitution. Margaret read that sentence, and the world around her went very quiet. Walter had not died of a heart attack. Walter had been murdered. For 8 months. 8 months of mornings she had carried him a cup of coffee. 8 months of evenings she had handed him his pills from the small ceramic dish on his bedside table. 8 months of kissing the top of his graying head and saying, "Take your medicine, my love, you have to take care of yourself." 8 months of feeding him poison from her own hand and not knowing. A sound came out of Margaret that she had never made before. A low animal sound breaking up from somewhere beneath her ribs, the sound of a woman who has just understood the shape of her own life. She pressed both fists against her mouth to push it back inside her. She rocked slowly forward on the cardboard box. The penlight wobbled. The attic walls swam. She did not allow herself to break. She made herself read the rest. Printed emails. Long threads of them. Between Vivienne Ashcroft and Theodore Higgins, the lawyer who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at her table for 20 years, the arrangements, the payments, the bribed private nurse, a quiet middle-aged woman named Lorna, who had come to the house 3 afternoons a week and who Margaret had once given a Christmas sweater. Lorna had been swapping Walter's heart medication for the synthetic amphetamine since the previous summer. 3 afternoons a week, from her own kitchen. Margaret folded the emails carefully and set them on top of the will. She picked up the black journal. Walter's voice rose up from the pages in his familiar slanting hand, and for a moment, alone in the attic of a house she had never known he owned, she could hear him. The cadence of his sentences, the way he would clear his throat before he said something difficult. The journal began 6 months before his death. The early entries were brief, suspicions. He had begun to notice that on the rare mornings he forgot to take his pills, his mind would clear for a few hours. The fog in his thinking would lift. He could see the boardroom maneuvers Vivienne had been making against him with terrible sharp clarity. Then he would take his evening dose and the fog would close in again. He had hired a private investigator, a man in Milwaukee. The investigator had followed Vivienne for 6 weeks and had brought back photographs and recordings. Walter had known he was being killed, and Walter had not been able to stop it without losing the chance to save Margaret. If he confronted Vivienne, she would accelerate. If he went to the police, Theo controlled the local department. If he changed the will openly, they would find a way to invalidate it. So he had done what he could. He had moved his money quietly. He had bought the house in Wisconsin through the shell company. He had built the vault. He had hidden the silver key in the false bottom of his oldest fishing box because he knew Vivienne would tear apart his desk, his safe, his closet, his car. But she would never think to look inside an old green tackle box that smelled of lake water and was good for nothing. The last entry was dated 4 days before Walter's death. The handwriting was rough, the letters slanting wildly across the page. He had stopped taking the pills entirely by then. He knew it would not save him. The damage was done. His heart was too far gone. But he could think for a little while longer, and he meant to use it. Maggie, if you are reading this, I am sorry. I tried. I tried to set every piece in place so that when you finally found this room, you would have what you needed. Go to Ellis Vaughn. He has a small house on Pine Hollow Road in Black River Falls. He has been my friend for 35 years, and you have never met him because I kept him separate on purpose for exactly this reason. He knows what to do. Trust him. I have loved you 40 years. I love you still. Margaret closed the journal. She sat for a very long time in the dark of the attic with the penlight shining up against her chest, and she allowed herself finally to cry. Not the small dignified weeping of the church office, not the silent tears in the back of the cab. She cried for 40 years. She cried for the coffee cups. She cried for the way he had said her name. She cried until her cardigan was wet through and her throat was raw and the inside of her nose ached. And then she stopped. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She gathered the documents and the journal and the hard drives. She placed them all back inside the manila envelope, and she carried the envelope down out of the attic, leaving the ladder and the shifted tile exactly as she had found them. She closed the vault, but did not lock it. She would come back for the money later. The money was not what mattered tonight. She slept that night on the canvas-covered sofa in the living room, with the manila envelope clutched against her chest like a child, and Walter's old green flannel jacket pulled over her like a blanket. The house creaked around her. The wind moved through the eaves. She did not dream. Morning came pale and slow through the boarded windows. A knock at the front door. Margaret sat up sharply, her heart bolting in her chest. She listened. The knock came again, 3 soft, polite raps. A man's voice followed, low and easy, the voice of a man who did not wish to frighten her. Margaret, my name is Ellis Vaughn. Walter told me you might come. I am alone. I am unarmed. I am going to step away from the door. Margaret rose from the sofa. She smoothed her white hair with one hand. She walked to the door in her stockinged feet, and she put her eye to the small peephole. A man stood at the edge of the porch, 72 years old, broad in the shoulders, white hair cut short. He wore a brown canvas barn coat and corduroy trousers. He held both empty hands at his sides where she could see them. His face was calm. His eyes were the color of the sky over Lake Michigan in November, and they were kind. Margaret opened the door. For a long moment, they only looked at each other. Then Ellis Vaughn, retired Wisconsin state trooper, friend of her husband for 35 years, said softly, "I am sorry I am late, ma'am. Walter asked me to wait 2 days before I came up the road. He said you would need time to read it alone." Margaret's throat closed. "You knew him?" "I fished with him every summer for 35 years, ma'am. He was the best man I ever met." Margaret stepped back from the door and let him in. Ellis took her to his own house. He drove an old green pickup truck along the logging road and out onto a county highway, and they came after 20 minutes to a small cedar shingled cabin set among red pines. A woman waited on the porch, 70 years old, silver hair in a long braid down her back, an apron over a plaid flannel shirt. Her name was Hattie. She had been a registered nurse for 41 years before she retired. She took one look at Margaret stepping down from the pickup and crossed the porch in 3 quick strides and gathered her into an embrace as if they had known each other their whole lives. "Oh, honey," Hattie said. "Oh, honey, come inside." Margaret allowed herself to be led. There was chicken soup on the stove. There was bread cooling on a rack. There was a small fire in a stone hearth and a quilted armchair pulled up beside it. Hattie sat Margaret down in the chair and pressed a hot mug of soup into her hands and would not let her speak until she had eaten. Margaret had not realized she was hungry. She had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. She ate 2 bowls of soup and a thick slice of bread spread with butter, and she felt the heat of it move down into her chest and out into her hands, and the trembling she had carried for 2 weeks finally began to ease. Ellis sat across from her at the kitchen table after she had eaten. He set the manila envelope between them but did not open it. "Walter sent me a packet 6 months ago, ma'am," he said. "Same documents you have there. He wanted me to hold on to a backup. He said if anything happened to him, you would come. He said you would not come right away. He said you would need to find your own way to me. He was very particular about that." Margaret looked at him. "Why?" "Because he said you needed to know you could do this. He said you had spent 40 years letting him take care of things, and that this was the one thing he could not take care of for you. He said you had to find the road yourself." Margaret pressed her palms flat against the wooden table. She did not speak. Ellis went on quietly. "There is more, ma'am, in Walter's journal. Did you read all of it?" "I read enough. There is a passage near the back, about 6 months before he died. He wrote that he had told someone he trusted about his suspicions. Someone who had come for tea one afternoon and asked him how he was sleeping. He thought he was confiding in a friend. He believed that friend would warn you if anything happened to him." Margaret felt the room narrow. "Who?" Ellis looked at her with great gentleness. "A woman named Coraline Whitfield." Margaret closed her eyes. The image came up unbidden. Cora at her own kitchen table, leaning across the formica, her hand on Walter's. "How are you feeling, Walter, dear? You look so tired lately." Walter trusting her. Walter telling her things he had not even told Margaret because he did not want to frighten her. Cora had taken that information directly to Vivienne. Cora had been bought. The lake house Vivienne had promised her. 30 years of friendship sold for a piece of waterfront property on a lake Cora had always coveted. Margaret opened her eyes. "She came to the funeral," she said. "She held my hand. She cried. 'I know, ma'am.' She made me soup." "Yes, for 3 nights she made me soup." Ellis did not answer. He only watched her, his hands folded on the table. Margaret drew a long, slow breath. The grief did not break her. It settled instead into something colder, something quieter, something that felt almost like clarity. "I do not have the luxury of being heartbroken, Ellis. No, ma'am, I expect you do not. For 3 days, Margaret stayed in the cedar cabin on Pine Hollow Road. Hattie set her up in a small bedroom that had once belonged to a daughter long since grown and gone. She lent Margaret clean clothes, a soft flannel shirt, a pair of wool trousers, thick socks. Margaret bathed for the first time in 2 weeks in a real bathtub, and she sat on the edge of the bed afterward and cried quietly for 10 minutes. And then she dried her eyes and went downstairs. Hattie taught her how to use the encrypted hard drives. Margaret was 78 years old. She had never owned a smartphone. She had never typed an email in her life. Walter had handled all of that. Hattie sat with her at the kitchen table for hours, patient as snowfall, showing her the small clicks and the small windows that opened and closed. Margaret made many mistakes. She lost a file twice. She nearly cried with frustration over a password that would not work, but she did not stop. On the second afternoon, working slowly with Hattie at her elbow, she opened a video file from the first hard drive. The footage was grainy. A hidden camera in the corner of Walter's bedroom angled down at the small ceramic dish on the bedside table. The timestamp read a Tuesday morning in February of that year. Vivienne entered the room. She was alone. She moved with the casual confidence of a woman who has done this many times before. She opened a small lacquered pillbox from her own purse. She removed a single white tablet. She replaced it in the ceramic dish with another tablet, identical in size and color, taken from her own pillbox. She left the room. The whole act took 22 seconds. Margaret watched it once. She watched it twice. She watched it a third time because she needed her body to believe what her eyes had already accepted. She turned off the screen. She rose from the table. She walked out onto the back porch of the cedar cabin, and she stood in the cold November sunlight, and she looked out at the rust-colored larches along the property line. Ellis came out and stood beside her. He did not speak. Ellis? Yes, ma'am. They thought I would never find this. They thought a 78-year-old woman could not climb a ladder. They thought I would die quietly in a Methodist church basement, and that would be the end of it. They underestimated you, ma'am. They underestimated my husband. Same thing, I suspect. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I want to take this to the FBI. Ellis turned to look at her. There was no surprise in his face, only a slow, careful respect. I can drive you to the field office in Chicago, ma'am. We can leave tomorrow morning. But that night, something changed. Margaret could not sleep. She rose at 3:30 in the morning and walked quietly down the dark hallway of the cedar cabin, intending only to drink a glass of water from the kitchen tap. She paused at the front window. Something pulled her eye toward the road. A vehicle, parked at the bend in the highway 200 yards down from the cabin. Headlights off, engine off. The faintest red glow of someone smoking a cigarette in the driver's seat. The shape of a black SUV. Margaret stood at the window with her glass of water in her hand and felt the cold travel down her spine. She did not move. She did not breathe louder than necessary. After a long minute, she walked very softly back down the hallway and woke Ellis with a hand on his shoulder. He came to the window in his robe. He looked for a long time. Then he went to the kitchen drawer and took out a small pair of binoculars, and he looked again. Wisconsin plates, but the bracket is wrong. Rental most likely. 2 men inside. I cannot see faces. They have found us. They have found the road, ma'am. That is not quite the same, but it is close enough. Ellis turned to her in the dim light of the hallway. Hattie had come out behind him in her nightgown, her silver braid over one shoulder, her face calm. Margaret, Ellis said, we can leave right now. There is a back trail through the timber that comes out on a county road 3 miles east. Walter and I used to hunt grouse on it. They will not know to watch it." Margaret stood in the hallway. She held the empty water glass in both hands. She thought about Walter in his study, writing in his journal with his hands shaking from poison. She thought about Cora on the telephone in her own kitchen. She thought about Vivienne swapping a single white pill in 22 seconds. She thought about every step she had walked in wet slippers alone in the cold of a Wisconsin October. She set the water glass down very carefully on the hallway table. "Ellis." "Yes, ma'am." "I am 78 years old. I have been running in one way or another for 2 weeks. I have run out of a marble house. I have run out of a church office. I have run out of a woman's brick colonial. I have run up a logging road. I have climbed into an attic." She lifted her chin. "I am finished running." Alice did not speak. "You will drive me to Chicago in the morning. Hattie will stay here. She will turn on every light in this house at 6 o'clock, and she will pour herself a cup of coffee at the kitchen window, and she will let them watch her, and she will give us 2 hours." Hattie nodded once. "And then you and I will go to the FBI, and I will put every document on the desk of a federal agent, and I will tell them what my husband and I have known. And those men in that black SUV will spend a long time wondering why I did not run." Alice looked at her for a long moment in the dim light of the hallway. His face did not move, but something in his eyes did. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "We will do exactly that." Margaret nodded. She walked back to the small guest bedroom that had once belonged to someone else's daughter. And she sat down on the edge of the bed in her borrowed flannel shirt, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited for morning. They left at 6 in the morning before the sun had cleared the pines. Hattie stood at the front window in her flannel robe with a cup of coffee in her hand, exactly as Margaret had asked, and she did not turn her head as the green pickup truck rolled quietly down the gravel drive with its headlights off. Ellis took the back trail through the timber. The truck bounced and groaned across roots and rutted earth, and Margaret braced one hand against the dashboard and held the manila envelope against her chest with the other. The black SUV at the bend in the highway never moved. They came out on a county road 3 miles east, just as Ellis had promised. He turned south. The pickup rattled down through the dark of central Wisconsin, the headlights cutting 2 narrow tunnels of yellow through the early morning fog. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say that morning that had not already been said in the hallway at 3 in the morning. The drive to Chicago took 5 hours. By the time the city skyline rose up out of the gray November haze, Margaret had washed her face in a gas station bathroom outside Rockford, put on a fresh blouse Hattie had pressed for her the night before, and pinned her white hair into a tidy knot at the back of her head. She walked into the lobby of the FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road at 11:15 in the morning. A 78-year-old woman in borrowed wool trousers with a manila envelope under her arm. And she asked the desk officer if she might speak with someone about a corporate conspiracy and a premeditated murder. The desk officer was young. He looked at her with the careful patience reserved for old women who have walked in off the street with grievances. He asked her if she could be more specific. Margaret set the manila envelope down on the counter between them. She slid out a single page, the toxicology report from the laboratory in Zurich, and turned it so he could read. The young officer read. Then he picked up the telephone. Agent Hollis Marston was a tall man in his middle 50s with a quiet face and a careful manner. He was a veteran of the white-collar crime division. He had spent 23 years putting wealthy people in prison for things they believed they were too important to be punished for. He led Margaret and Ellis to a small conference room on the 4th floor brought them coffee in paper cups, and sat down across the table. Margaret laid the documents out one by one. The real will, the toxicology report, the printed emails, the two encrypted hard drives, Walter's black leather journal. She walked Agent Marsden through each piece slowly, and in order the way a teacher walks a child through long division. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. She had done all of her shaking already in an attic alone. Agent Marsden listened without interrupting for 45 minutes. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not look at her with skepticism. He did not look at her at all, in fact, until she had finished. When she finished, he set down his pen. Mrs. Holloway, yes, I have to tell you something now that may surprise you. I would ask that you let me finish before you respond. Margaret folded her hands. 6 months ago, Agent Marsden said, this office received an anonymous package in the mail. It was postmarked from Chicago. Inside were 3 items: a photograph of a private nurse named Lorna Beckwith leaving the Holloway estate, a copy of a wire transfer from an offshore account belonging to Vivienne Ashcroft to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands, and a typed note 2 sentences long. The note read, "My wife will come to you when it is done. Please believe her." It was unsigned. We were unable to authenticate it, but we opened a quiet file. We have been watching Vivienne Ashcroft and Theodore Higgins for 4 months. Margaret did not move. It was Walter, she said. We believe so, yes. She closed her eyes. 40 years. 40 years she had been married to him, and she had not known the half of what he had carried for her. And even at the end, even on his last clear day with his hand shaking and his heart failing, he had been writing letters to the federal government to make sure that when she walked through the door of this office, someone would believe her. Margaret pressed one hand against her mouth. She did not weep. She had wept enough. But she could not speak for a full minute, and Agent Marsden, who had seen many things in 23 years, looked down at his yellow legal pad and waited. The takedown happened 3 days later. Margaret was not present, but she watched the news from a small motel room in Skokie with Ellis and Hattie beside her. Federal agents arrived at the Lake Forest estate at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. The cameras of 3 local stations caught the front doors of the mansion swinging open. Vivienne Ashcroft was escorted out in handcuffs. She wore a cream silk blouse and gray wool trousers. Her hair was perfect. Her face was white as paper. She did not scream. She did not weep. She walked to the federal vehicle in silence, and only as the agent placed his hand on her head to guide her into the back seat did she lift her chin and look directly into the nearest camera. And the look on her face was not rage. It was the look of a woman who has just understood that she has lost. Preston was arrested in his bedroom in silk pajamas. He wept openly. He asked for his mother. He was put into a separate vehicle. Theodore Higgins was arrested at the same hour in the middle of a board meeting on the 32nd floor of a glass tower downtown. He stood up when the agents entered the room. He set his pen down on his legal pad. He said quietly that he understood, and he held out his wrists. The press described it as the largest white-collar arrest in Illinois in a decade. That evening on the local news, a smaller story ran near the bottom of the broadcast. A 68-year-old woman named Caroline Whitfield, longtime resident of Lake Forest, had been taken into federal custody on charges of conspiracy and accessory after the fact. The newscaster read the name without emphasis. Cora's photograph appeared briefly on screen. A studio portrait, the kind taken for a charity board. She wore pearls and a soft smile. Margaret watched her old friend's face on the motel television. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel rage. She felt only a low, quiet tiredness, the kind that comes after a long fever has finally broken. She reached for the remote. She turned off the television. The legal aftermath took 6 months. The forged will was thrown out by a probate court in Cook County. The real will was admitted and certified. Margaret Holloway was named sole heir to the entire Holloway estate. Vivienne and Theo were indicted on charges of first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and tampering with a controlled substance. Preston was indicted as an accomplice. The trials would eventually result in life sentences for Vivienne and Theo and 25 years for Preston. Lorna Beckwith, the private nurse, took a plea deal. She would serve 15 years. Coraline Whitfield was sentenced to 11. Margaret did not attend any of the trials. She read the transcripts later alone in a quiet room. She did not move back into the house in Lake Forest. She sold it in March to a young technology executive and his wife for $12 million. She did not walk through it one last time. She did not need to. The house was full of ghosts, and not all of them were Walter's. She used the proceeds and a substantial portion of the recovered Holloway assets to establish the Walter Holloway Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to providing legal aid and emergency housing to elderly widows who had been defrauded of their inheritances. The foundation opened its first office that summer. Within a year, it was operating in 14 states. Margaret bought a small apartment in downtown Chicago for the weeks she needed to be near the company. She fired 6 members of the board of directors. She replaced them with people Walter had once told her, in passing over the years, were honest. She did not try to run the company herself. She was 79 by then, and she had no interest in software. She found a chief executive, a quiet, competent woman from Minneapolis, and she let her work. But the place Margaret called home from the spring after the trials forward was the white clapboard house on the unpaved logging road in Black River Falls. She had it repaired. The roof was replaced. The siding was scraped and repainted white again, but a softer white than before. The boarded window was opened and reglazed. The porch was leveled. A new stone path was laid from the drive to the front steps. Inside, the canvas sheets were finally taken off the furniture, which turned out to be an old, comfortable set of leather chairs and a long oak table that Walter must have bought for the house decades ago and never used. The attic was the last room to be finished. Margaret had it cleared out. The vault was removed by a team of specialists and the safe contents quietly transferred to a real bank. The plywood floor was sanded and polished. 2 large dormer windows were cut into the roof and the cedar walls were finished with a pale stain. Bookshelves were built along 3 walls floor to ceiling. A large soft armchair was placed near one window, with a small table beside it for a reading lamp and a cup of tea. By the following autumn, the attic that had once held Walter's last secret was the brightest room in the house. It was there on a still afternoon in late October. Almost exactly 1 year after the day Vivienne had closed the door behind her in the rain, that Ellis Vaughan came to see her with one last envelope. Margaret was sitting in the attic armchair with a book open on her lap and a cup of tea on the small table beside her. The window was open a crack, and the smell of wood smoke drifted up from the chimney of the cabin 3 miles down the road, where Ellis and Hattie still lived. Ellis climbed the ladder slowly. He had grown a little more careful with his knees. He sat down on the low wooden bench by the bookshelves, and he set a small flat envelope on the table beside Margaret's tea. The envelope was old. The paper had yellowed at the corners. Across the front, in Walter's familiar slanting hand, was a single line: "To be opened by Margaret only when it is all finished." Margaret looked at Ellis. Ellis looked at his hands. "He gave it to me 2 weeks before he died, ma'am. He said I would know when it was time. He said you would know too. Margaret reached for the envelope. Her hands were steady. She broke the seal. Inside were two things: a small black and white photograph and a single folded sheet of yellow legal paper. The photograph she recognized at once. Their wedding day, June of 1985, on the lawn of the small Lutheran church on the lakefront. Walter in a dark suit, his hair still mostly brown, then his head thrown slightly back in a laugh. Margaret beside him in a knee-length cream dress and a small veil, her hands held in both of his, looking up at his face as if she could not quite believe he was real. She remembered the photographer asking them to look at the camera. She remembered Walter saying not yet under his breath, and she remembered turning to him instead of the camera. And that was the moment. She had not seen this photograph in 40 years. She turned it over in her hands. On the back in Walter's hand, written long ago, was a small note. The first hour of the rest of my life. June 8th, 1985. Margaret pressed the photograph to her chest. She did not weep. She had cried enough for 100 women's lifetimes by now. She held the photograph against her heart and breathed slowly and let the past wash through her like clean water. Then she unfolded the letter. Walter's handwriting, slower than the frantic notes in the tackle box, calmer. Written perhaps on one of his last clear days. My Maggie, if you are reading this, you have done all of it. You have walked through the rain. You have climbed the ladder. You have opened the vault. You have carried the truth into a federal office, and you have done it with the steadiness I always knew you had, and you somehow never believed in. I am writing to tell you one last time what I have been trying to tell you for 40 years. You were never the small thing you thought you were. You were never the quiet woman in my shadow. You were the steady ground I stood on. You were the reason I built any of it. I built all of it for you. I am sorry that I left you to do this alone. I am sorry that the last gift I could give you was a key in a fishing box and a long cold road through Wisconsin. I tried, Maggie. I tried to leave you everything you would need. I could not leave you the one thing I wanted most, which was the rest of our life together. But I could leave you the truth, and I could leave you the chance to take it back from them. Take it back. Live a long time. Sit in the sun. Sell the house if it hurts to be there. Keep the Wisconsin place if it brings you peace. Plant something. Fish if you ever want to remember me. The tackle box is yours. The rod in the upstairs closet is yours. 40 years was not enough, my love. It was not nearly enough. But it was everything. Yours always, Walter. Margaret read the letter once. Then she folded it carefully in half and laid it on her lap and turned her face toward the open dormer window. And she closed her eyes. Outside in the cooling October light, a single yellow leaf drifted past the glass and was gone. Ellis sat on the bench across the room and did not move. After a long while he rose very quietly and made his way to the ladder and climbed down. He left her alone. Margaret sat in the attic armchair until the sun moved off the floor and the room went gold at the edges. She did not read the letter again. She did not need to. She held the photograph in one hand and the letter in the other, and she watched the light change, and she thought about a young woman in a cream dress who had once turned at the wrong moment and looked up at the man beside her instead of the camera. That young woman had been right. There are some things a camera cannot capture. There are some things only a heart can keep. The Wisconsin winter came early that year. By the first week of November, snow had begun to fall in slow, steady curtains across the pines. Margaret bought a heavy wool coat in a soft gray and a pair of good leather boots, and she walked every morning down the path to the small lake behind the house, where Ellis had repaired the dock and built a small wooden bench at the end of it for her to sit on. Some mornings Ellis came with her. Some mornings she went alone. The lake was still and dark and very deep. Walter had stocked it years ago, Ellis told her, with smallmouth bass and bluegill, intending always to bring her here, and not knowing how to explain the house without explaining everything else. In the spring, when the ice broke, Margaret learned to fish. She was 79 years old, and her hands were not steady the way they had once been, and her knees ached when she knelt to release a fish. But she learned. Ellis taught her the same way Walter had taught her in 1985, only slower, and with more patience for an old woman's pace. Hattie packed lunches. They ate on the dock. They did not always speak. The silence between three old friends, two of whom had known her husband, was a comfortable thing. The green tackle box sat on the mantel of the stone fireplace in the living room, where Margaret could see it from the dining table. She did not use it. It was no longer a tackle box. It was the small, simple thing in which her husband had hidden the truth that saved her life, and she meant for it to be the last thing she looked at each night before she went up the stairs to bed. On a warm Saturday in June, almost 2 full years after the day Vivienne had closed the door, Margaret stood in the upstairs library of her Wisconsin house and looked out the dormer window at the lake. The sun was on the water. A loon called from somewhere out beyond the reeds. In her hand was a letter from the foundation in Chicago. 2 more widows that week, both in their 70s, both stripped of everything by adult children they had loved. Margaret folded the letter. She would call the foundation Monday. She would call her lawyer Tuesday. She would find these women homes and lawyers and quiet rooms in which to begin again. She turned from the window. The afternoon light fell across the room in long warm bars, and somewhere in the attic of an old white house in the Wisconsin woods, an old woman who had once stood in the rain with a trash bag at her feet smiled very quietly at no one in particular. If you have ever loved someone who was taken from you too soon, and you have ever wondered whether the love itself was enough, whether it left anything behind that mattered, whether it could still find you in the dark of a long October, when everything else had been taken away, then perhaps this story has been for you. Tell me in the comments below. Who was the person who loved you enough to leave you a key